Okay, so welcome everyone. This is Professor Lisa Ramos. I'm here representing the San Antonio College Mexican American Studies program. I am also the chair for Raza Heritage Month, and we are pleased for our fourth event to have with us two filmmakers from the Rio Grande Valley. So tonight's event is called A Conversation with Pansy. Explore the roots of the LGBTQ plus community of the Rio Grande Valley. And our two filmmakers with us today are Gabriel Sanchez and Ronnie Garga. So before I introduce them and turn it over to them, I do want to read a land acknowledgement. We are starting all our events this way. So, what is a land acknowledgement? It is an Indigenous protocol to show gratitude to Indigenous peoples who've been living and working on these lands for thousands of years. We want to thank the Indigenous caretakers of this land. We would like to begin by acknowledging that San Antonio College in San Antonio, Texas, occupy Indigenous lands. We also acknowledge the Carrizo Comecrudo Nation, whose traditional territory we are also living on. Finally, we acknowledge other Native nations within Texas whom various settler colonizer societies forcibly displaced from their native territories. As past, present, and future caretakers and knowledge keepers of this land, we are committed not only to acknowledging these Indigenous lands and Indigenous peoples, but also committed to addressing and deconstructing our own privileges and internalized settler colonizer thoughts and behaviors. We respectfully ask for permission to teach, learn, and grow on these lands. Over the next month, we will strive to counter the doctrine of discovery. We will strive to show that we can practice survival, strength, and resilience, which for too long has dismissed Indigenous peoples. So now I'm going to go ahead and read the bios for our two filmmakers. So our first guest is Gabriel Sanchez. Gabriel Sanchez is a queer and non-binary native of the Rio Grande Valley. For the past 5 years, they have been researching, documenting, archiving, and presenting on the history of the Rio Grande Valley's LGBTQ plus community. They are currently working on the documentary Pansy Pachanga, which documents and chronicles the history of the Rio Grande Valley's LGBTQIA plus community over the course of several decades, and the rich history of survival and resilience found in this community. Gabriel is also a performing drag queen and is the president of the South Texas Equality Project, a coalition of different organizations that work to uplift and advocate for the LGBTQ plus community of the Valley, and is a part of Gentex, a trans-led organization that works to provide visibility and support for the Valley's trans population. Our next filmmaker is Ronnie Garga. Ronnie Garga is an artist, filmmaker, educator, and activist working out of the Rio Grande Valley. He has been working in video journalism since 2014, covering issues on abortion access, immigration, and border issues. His first documentary, As I Walk Through the Valley, premiered at the 2017 South by Southwest Film Festival and has been shown at Stanford University, the University of North Texas, and film festivals around the world. He is working on 2 additional documentaries about the history of the Rio Grande Valley, Pansy Pachanga and 11,000 Years of History in the Rio Grande Valley, which is currently in production. Pansy Pachanga covers the history of the LGBTQ plus community over the course of the last 50 years, tracking the growth of the community through the first gay bars, the community response to the HIV/AIDS crisis, and the growth of a visible trans community. 11,000 Years of History in the Rio Grande Valley is a documentary series which covers the general history of the region, including the Native American history up to the present, with a special focus on civil rights, culture, and Mexican American identity over time. So I'm now going to turn it over to Gabriel and Ronnie, and they're going to introduce the film. Thank you all.
Okay, so Gabriel, I think you might need to unmute yourself, but thank you everybody for tuning in. My name is Ronnie Garga. I'm the co-director along with Gabriel Sanchez of Pansy Pachanga. And today what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and share a presentation with you, and we'll introduce ourselves and how this project got started. And then we will show you a few clips as well from the upcoming film.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and share the presentation. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. Should be sharing. There we go. Can everybody see that?
Okay, yeah, it looks like it's up on the screen now. Just go into, yeah, exactly. Go into, actually go into present. Up at the top, that little yellow button where it says present.
Hold on. Sorry, technical difficulties. I'm not seeing the present button. This is...
I can share it over here on this side if you want to, and then you can just tell me where to step through.
Yeah, I just wanted to. Okay, yeah, I'm not getting the present button on my screen for some reason.
Well, let me try over here real quick. Sorry about that, guys. So, to the presentation here. Let me come back to the front.
There we go.
Okay, great. So this is our logo for the movie. So thank you all so much for coming out. Thank you so much to the San Antonio College for hosting us. And we're really excited about being able to present here during Raza Heritage Month about our new film that chronicles the history of the LGBT community in the Rio Grande Valley. We are the two co-directors, Gabriel Sanchez and myself, Ronnie Garga. And I guess, Gabriel, if you want to start us off by just letting us know how you got started with this whole project in general, where the inspiration for starting to document this history came from.
Yeah, absolutely. So happy LGBTQ plus History Month to everybody. October is LGBT History Month, so I think it's especially appropriate that we're doing this right now. And it's also Raza Heritage Month, as Ronnie mentioned. And that's also what we're celebrating and observing today. And I think it's great because our documentary really is about the intersection of those two identities. We're chronicling the history of the LGBTQ community in a primarily Latinx area along the border that's shaped by a layer of different cultures, both Mexican, American, and lots of different cultures in between. And so thank you again for having us and thank you for being here. I always start off, we're gonna talk a little bit about how this project got started. Really, Ronnie and I are both really committed to telling the story of our community because it's so often misunderstood, and a lot of the portrayals you see about the border region and about the Rio Grande Valley are often very negative. And so in our own ways, we've been working to correct those narratives and to center Valley people in Valley stories and have more representation with stories about the Rio Grande Valley that's coming from people who are from the Rio Grande Valley and understand the Rio Grande Valley. And so this project got started about 5 years ago. I wanted to document the LGBTQ plus history of this region. I've always been a huge history buff, and I've always been really, really interested, especially in LGBTQ plus history, ever since I came out. But I always kind of operated under the assumption, like I think a lot of people who come from small towns in places like Texas, that the area that I came from didn't have a rich LGBTQ plus history. I didn't think that there was very much history here to document. And so little by little, I started to kind of piece that together, and that eventually grew through our collaboration into this project. So I always start off when I present on this history with a little quote from Joan Nestle. And Joan Nestle was the founder of the Lesbian History Archives and a big voice in LGBTQ plus activism from the 50s on. But she says, history is not a dead thing or a sure thing. It's lived with our choices and our dreams. It is a story of our glories and our sadnesses. It is always a collective memory, as complicated and contradictory as people who lived it, but it is always a people story. And then she also says, one of the lessons I have learned in trying to live with our history is that for every repression, we have found a suitable form of resistance. And that last part is really one of the things that we try to capture in our documentary. Being queer or being trans in a place like the Rio Grande Valley at a time like the 1950s or 60s or 70s, you were going to face a lot of repression. You were going to be surrounded by a society and a culture that in many ways didn't want you to exist and had no problem telling you that they didn't want you to exist. And our community, as LGBT people have done around the world and throughout the country, throughout time, have found ways to resist that oppression and to challenge that oppression and to support each other through that oppression. So that's really one of the stories we seek to tell. I also really wanted to, I like this quote a lot because Joan Nestle is someone who spent decades chronicling LGBTQ history and especially lesbian and trans history. And she talks a lot about how oral history is contradictory, it's complicated, it relies on memory. In this documentary, we really are relying on people's memories of certain events, and those can be really, really contradictory. People don't always remember dates the same way or events the same way. And that's part of the magic, I think, of a documentary where we let people tell stories in their own words, is that we get to kind of see and engage with their understanding of their history. But the last thing I'll say about Joan Nestle is it's interesting because she's been one of my biggest inspirations, but I didn't know that she had her own connection to Rio Grande Valley LGBTQ plus history. She published and edited the groundbreaking work, The Persistent Desire in 1992, and it chronicles the history of butch femme traditions among the lesbian community. And butch femme traditions are something that kind of fell out of style in the lesbian communities in the 1970s, but in places like the Valley and among working class people of color, they really were the dominant means of understanding gender expression among queer women. And she wrote this anthology, which includes the first story by a woman named Rocky Gomez, who is a lesbian writer from the Rio Grande Valley, who wrote a series of stories called The Glorious Stories, that deal with this kind of interesting cast of characters of queer and trans people in the Rio Grande Valley in the 1960s. And it's a really interesting window into a time period that isn't really often chronicled. And so one of her stories appears in this book. And so where do we begin documenting a community's history? How do we start telling a history that isn't often told? And one of the things that I always have to explain to people is that this isn't something that you can just Google. We really are the first people documenting this history in this particular way and trying to collect as many voices as possible from this history. And so it can be a little challenging to figure out how to start doing that. But history really is all around us. History, it exists, everywhere, but it's often hidden. We are often not taught about our history as Latinx people or as LGBTQ plus people because history often centers white cishet people and especially cishet men, right? But these are just some things that I remember, some examples of how history is all around us. The picture of the woman holding the baby is a picture of my uncle Leonardo. And I talk about him a lot when I talk about this project because he was one of the primary inspirations for this. I first heard about Leonardo when I was a small child, and I was told that he was gay and he died. That's it. He was my uncle, and that's all I was ever told about him was that he was gay and he died. And so what I internalized from a young age was that if you were queer on the borderlands, you would meet a violent end, because that's what happened to my uncle. And I didn't really learn too much else about him until I started chronicling this history. And I found out that he'd owned the first queer bar in the Valley to be owned by a queer person. He helped plan the first Pride Month celebration in the Rio Grande Valley in the early 1990s. And he had a major impact on growing the drag community in the Rio Grande Valley, on creating a flourishing and vibrant drag scene. And I think in the Rio Grande Valley, like in San Antonio, we have a drag scene that we're really proud of, that I think is really creative and really cool. And to find out that he was a part of starting that was really, really important for me, because it's not something I would have known unless I'd interviewed all these other people outside of my family. The other picture is of a woman named Mary Pat Strong. And she was my teacher in high school. I had her for a 10th grade technology class. And she, I remember telling us a story about how she had left her previous school because she had started the Gay Straight Alliance there after a student had committed suicide. She'd helped some students start a Gay Straight Alliance, and she was kind of pushed out of her teaching position. And it stuck with me, and I couldn't stop thinking about how important it was for this woman who was very visibly queer, even if she couldn't be out as a high school teacher in Texas in the early 2000s, talking about this amazing act that cost her job in a way. And so it stuck with me, and I thought someday I want to tell that story. Someday I want to learn more about that story. And then the other picture is a picture of a club called 10th Avenue. It's a headline of when the club was being forced to close by the city of McAllen. And I remember being around 12 years old when that happened and hearing about it on the playground, and a bunch of the boys being like, oh yeah, my cousin told me they closed down the only gay bar in McAllen because it was disgusting and gross and the gays were all gross. And I just remember it sticking with me that I was like, there's probably more to that story. Why did this club have to close down? Why did the city make this club close down? Because all the gays were gross. And so that was another kernel that kind of stuck in my head that I wanted to go back and revisit when I started this project. Just some more examples of how history is all around us. This is a picture on the left of Keisha Ross. I met her as a small child, actually, or as a teen. And she just stuck out to me so much because she was so vibrant and so alive, and she was so visibly queer. And I remember being very closeted at the time and feeling just like so, curious as to what it would be like to be so visibly queer. So her visibility had a huge impact on me. And it wasn't until I started doing this project that I found out that she had this long history as a performing drag queen at that club at 10th Avenue, and that she was one of the first visible black drag queens in the Valley, and that she kind of paved the way for some of the black queens who came after her. And she passed away, unfortunately, from complications related to AIDS. And so it's an example of how we lose a lot of our history as queer people because of the violence and the epidemics that we've survived in the past. But also of the impact of visibility on people. And so I was really happy to be able to find this picture of her later and sort of honor the memory of what an impact she had on me. There's also a picture of a woman named Betty and her wife, Syria. I also met them when I was a teen, and again, was just blown away by their visibility. It made me feel like there was a life beyond the closet and that I could someday be in a healthy, visible queer relationship. And then later, they would go on to become the first couple in the Rio Grande Valley to get legally married when marriage equality became the law of the land. And so they made history, and we tell that story in our documentary. I think it's one of our favorite clips, favorite pieces of the documentary is telling that story of their relationship and how they had the courage to kind of pave the way for other people. And then the last thing is a picture from a newspaper talking about Archer Park and how night brings out the dark side of Archer Park. And they don't ever use the word queer in there, but they talk about how Archer Park at night is full of unsavory elements and people you don't want families around and people who are not conducive to a family environment. And they are talking about queer people because this club, up until my childhood, was one of the most visible, identifiable queer spaces in the Rio Grande Valley. And we found out that it has a history going all the way back to the late 1950s of being a queer space where people would gather and go to meet other people like themselves when they didn't have any other spaces to do that. And I grew up hearing about it and people calling it the Fruit Loop. But to find out it has a really rich and important history was really cool later. But these are all just examples of how history and our community's history is all around us. It's just not often taught to us or told us. We kind of have to do the work of digging for it and finding it. Okay, and so when I finally decided to do this project, it was because I was asked to do a presentation on LGBTQ plus history for a group of queer men for a retreat. And then I was asked to do it for a local Pride Month celebration. And someone said, well, why don't you focus on Valley queer history? And I said, because we don't have any queer history in the Valley. And that was really what I believed. And I thought we didn't have any history worth documenting, any history worth telling. But I thought, well, why don't I just ask, see what I can dig up or see who I can find. And these are some of the first people I interviewed. One of them is my uncle Herbie, who grew up in the Valley in the 1960s and 1970s and moved to Houston. And I just asked him to tell me all the clubs he remembered from the 1970s when he was living here in the Valley. And I wrote them all down and I still have that paper. And it made me curious to find out more about the stories behind the clubs and the drag queens he mentioned. There's also a picture of a woman named Sonia, who is the great aunt of my brother's boyfriend. And finding her, we were so lucky because there's not a lot of people who have been out for as long as she has. She's a trans woman who grew up in the Valley in the 40s and 50s, came out in the 1960s, and it's just a walking encyclopedia of what it was like to be visibly queer at that time. Then there's a couple, Lori Coffey and Alicia Lugo. They are two of the founders of a group called Valley Voice, and they were two of the most visible activists in the LGBTQ plus community in the Rio Grande Valley in the 80s and early 90s. And so interviewing them, I got to learn that there wasn't just clubs and bars, there was also a lot of activism. And then this is the first picture I ever got for the project. It's a Betty Crocker at a club called 10th Avenue. And she is a drag queen who has a very unique style and has been really important to several generations of queer people in the Valley. And so these were the first 4 or 5 interviews I did. And then from there, this project just blossomed. I asked them if they knew other people. I asked them if they knew who else I could interview. And just from looking at some of their pictures that I helped them dig up and unearth, we really started connecting the dots on this story. So these are some of the questions I sought to answer with this project. I'll just go through them kind of quickly, but I wanted to know what daily life was like for LGBTQI plus people in the Valley in previous generations. And this is a picture and I wanted to know what spaces were important to the community. Where did the community gather? Oh, this is a picture of a musician named Angela, who Ronnie actually interviewed for his previous documentary as well, because she was part of several notable punk bands in the Rio Grande Valley. But she was one of the most visible sort of lesbian women in the Valley for several generations. And then her partner at the time, Laura, was an asexual identified photographer who took lots of pictures documenting the community. And I just really love these Polaroids they took at a club. There's also, I wanted to know what spaces were important to the community. And where the community gathered, where the community went to find other people like themselves. And this is a picture of several drag queens at PBD's, which is the oldest gay bar in South Texas. I wanted to know how people found and created community. I think now with the internet, it's a lot easier for queer people to find other people like themselves. But in a time like the 60s and 70s, where would you go to find other people who were like you? And this is a picture of people dancing at a club called Bumpers. And then what were the risks that people faced if they were visibly out? What challenges they encounter? Someone we interviewed said that our queer ancestors embodied a lot of bravery to be who they were at times that were less accepting. And I really wanted to tell that story. I really wanted to know what risks were people taking being out and why did they just make the decision to be out anyway? And then what firsthand documents did the community leave? Was there any art, pictures, other items that the community left behind? And I was so pleased to find not only photographs, there's also a publication put out, a very DIY zine style publication put out by and for the Valley's LGBTQ plus community in the 1980s and 1990s called In Touch magazine. It was done by a group called Valley Voice. And so finding several issues of that was a revelation because it was such a window into the community at the time. So those are some of the sources I used to put this history together. And then I wrote these, after spending about 1.5 years researching this history and doing all these interviews, collecting these photos, and kind of piecing together the dots of this history, I wrote a few articles for a local media platform for LGBTQ plus History Month about some of the first active advocacy groups, some of the first bars, and that's sort of how this project started to come together.
Okay, and then so I'll just mention briefly about how the documentary got started itself. So just as Gabriel was mentioning, I noticed what these articles that were being written and the stories that were in there, the photos that were in there, and we had just finished. Me and my co-director for As I Walk Through the Valley had just finished this documentary about the region, but it was covering the history of the music of the region, and especially like the punk music of the region and the origins of that and the evolution of that. So that one was called As I Walk Through the Valley. We showed that one at South by Southwest. We made a bunch of kind of like promotional materials. These are some of the materials from the documentary. And that's my co-director Charlie Vela and me there at South by Southwest screening the film. And we have a studio, One Scene Studios, and Pansy Pachanga is our second attempt at trying to tell some of the history of the region. I have a third project called 11,000 Years of History in the Rio Grande Valley. That's a more of a general history of the region, but this second documentary, Pansy Pachanga, is hopefully going to be something that really introduces people, not just from the region, but nationally, to the place, so that they can learn not just about the LGBT community, but they can also learn about the region and its history, the valley, the Rio Grande Valley's history. But part of the idea with these documentaries is to really highlight what this place is really about, to highlight what we think are some of the best parts of the place. So for me and Charlie, growing up in the music scene, that was something that we wanted to share. And then, being part of the LGBT community as well, this is something I'm very excited to be able to share with Gabriel, this history of the LGBT community here in the region. There are a few clips maybe that we're going to show throughout the presentation, but we can show you maybe one to begin with, and then we're going to do some more of the general history to kind of take you through what we're going to be covering throughout the documentary. But we'll try and sprinkle in a few clips as we go. The documentary is almost complete. So we're kind of finishing the first draft at the moment, and we're going to be submitting to some film festivals. So we do hope to have the feature film available early next year. And we already have a bunch of preview clips that are up on YouTube, and we're going to show you some of those. But we have a bunch of preview clips that we put out during Pride Month back in June that people can check out right now to kind of get a sense as to what is going on with the picture. So Gabriel, can we show the Lady Laura? We'll show that one, and then we'll move on. Okay, so let me go ahead and cue that one up. I'm going to share my screen here.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Lady Laura, there you are. Okay, so this first clip that we're going to show is a little bit of biographical information about one of the performers here in the region, Lady Laura, and then we'll see her perform a little bit as well. But this is some of the early footage that we filmed for Pansy Pachanga. I'll go ahead and show you the clip right now. It's just 2 minutes.
I grew up in Raymondville, a big old ranch out in the country, and I remember that I was working on the field at the age of 5, and I remember and going crazy. Of course, I didn't know I was gay until later on in life. Yes, I got my life on the field. Always say I would see everyone like this. Because migrants, we traveled up, we came back, we were here. We can do a little fortune. Was a migrant on my own. I went through a lot. I would travel up north to Ohio. I would go to the school, public school, when I was 15 years old. Those white people was there. They didn't.
Okay, so we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Let me try to reload this video. It's possible we may not be able to play it.
Thanks for your patience.
I apologize for that.
It's been interesting to adapt, 2020 to all these different platforms, and so thanks for bearing.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I'll share it again, and we'll try one more time.
I grew up in Raymondville in a big old ranch on the country. And I remember that I was working out in the fields at the age of 5. And going crazy. It's too dark. Of course, I didn't know I was gay until later on in life. Yes, I worked on my life on the field for my family. One of these days, I'll receive real ones like this, okay? I haven't received them in 20 years. We became migrants. We would travel up north, came back. We would work here. We can do the Wheel of Fortune tonight. I was a migrant all my life. I went through a lot when we would travel up north to Ohio. I would go to the school, the public school. When I was 15 years old, those white people didn't want us there.
Okay, so we're having technical difficulties on our preview clips, on our fresh clips. These are some clips that we just cut. So these are not uploaded anywhere. So when we're trying to share these files, it looks like we're having some amount of buffering here on YouTube. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and move into the rest of the presentation, and we're going to be showing some other clips from YouTube a little bit later when we get into the drag histories. So hopefully those should stream a little bit better.
Yeah, for sure. And I love Lady Laura's interview because I don't know if y'all could hear where she talked about her experiences growing up as a migrant farm worker in the fields. And she said, you know, those white people didn't want us there. So she talked about the struggle of knowing she was gay all her life. And then also the struggle of being like, she's from Raymondville, which is a very small rural community here in the Valley. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, even by Valley standards. And she talks a lot about in her interview about growing up as a migrant farm worker and the work ethic that she was instilled with, but also the struggles of being so visibly queer and gender nonconforming in that kind of environment. Lady Laura was one of the first interviews I did. I think she was like maybe the 6th or 7th person I talked to. She gave me some of my first pictures. And when I had this idea to do like a local LGBTQ history exhibit, she gave me some of her older dresses and stuff, which was really cool. She was also the first, that stuff from the flower shop was some of the first stuff we filmed for the documentary too. And it was just really cool. We just kind of like winged it that day and said, well, why don't you take us to one of the spots where you get some of your stuff? And so we got this really cool, in the Valley, there's tons, especially in downtown McAllen, tons of like these florerias. And we just got some cool images of her just kind of being herself, radically visible, shopping for flowers in this downtown shop. And it was a really cool experience. And then later we went back to her house and filmed her doing her makeup for a show that night. Ronnie, is there anything else you wanted to share about that clip?
No, I mean, we got some great footage of her that night at PBD's, and so it's a nice kind of round trip from the flower shop where she's picking out the flowers to the presentation where the flowers are part of the outfit and the whole thing. So it's a good clip. I'm excited for people to see it. Maybe I can upload it to YouTube real quick right now in the meantime. But Gabriel, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and share the presentation again. So it's going to start here at the beginning of the history portion. Unless you want to try and share it again, so that way you can control it. I can't hear you.
I'm on mute. Give me 1 second to try to share it one more time.
Okay.
Okay, can you see it?
if you just go to click on where it says view and then hit present, it should go to the full screen.
Okay, I'm trying to find where it says view, but I don't have that tab on mine. You know what? I think. Do you see it on here?
We see it. Yeah, it's there.
Okay, view. But can you see the view button?
No, I mean I can't see that high on your screen. But I mean, you could present it like that. I mean, it'll just show the thumbnails on the side. It won't show the images quite as large.
Okay, give me just a second. So yeah, what we're going to show you are just some of our favorite pictures from this project, and talk a little bit more about the history and the evolution of the Rio Grande Valley's LGBTQ plus community, and give you all a taste of some of what the documentary is going to look like, or what the community that the documentary is going to. Okay, hold on. Can you see it?
Yeah, I mean we can see it.
Okay, so this is these are so some of the themes that we explore in our in telling this story. I think we're sort of figuring out, like, okay, well, what are we going to focus on and what's important? And I think some people might have had a hard time understanding maybe why we chose to focus on certain elements, or people unfamiliar with this history might have a hard time, I think, understanding why we chose to focus on some of the elements that we did. But gay bars and clubs are a big part of our story. We do spend a lot of time exploring some of these venues. And that's because in previous decades, these were often some of the only queer spaces that existed. They were often some of the only spaces that people could freely exist as themselves. They allowed people to find other people like themselves and kind of engage and develop community. And they were sometimes the only space to develop platonic, romantic, or sexual relationships with other people. It's important to remember that, especially before the advent of the internet, there weren't a lot of spaces for queer people to go. And younger generations of LGBTQ plus people might not understand the significance of a space like a bar, and might not understand why gay bars often became the centers of community. And one of the things we found that I think Ronnie and I both, this was something we both find really cool, is that gay bars weren't just places where people went and got drinks. They were places where people had commitment ceremonies. They were places where people raised money for their friends and loved ones who were affected by AIDS. They were places where people met friends that they made all their life. They were sometimes the first time that someone saw another queer person in their lives. We've interviewed several people who said they thought they were the only one until they went to 10th Avenue or went to PBD's or went to one of these other places. Drag, I think, is also really important. And I think people who are outside of the LGBT community might not always understand why drag is so important and why we spend so much time, like why drag occupies such an important space in the community. But drag allowed for queer and trans people to really perform gender on their own terms and celebrate their gender variance and their gender diversity. And for many trans and gender nonconforming people, drag was sometimes the first opportunity to safely explore their gender identity. A lot of the older trans people that we've interviewed said that they first came out, the first time that they ever were able to explore what it felt like to be a woman or to be a man was to do drag. There's also a lot of power and a lot to be said about what it is like to be tortured all your life, ridiculed all your life, and made bad to feel all your life for being feminine if you're someone assigned male at birth, to then turn around and walk into a space where you're celebrated for your ability to perform femininity and where you can allow your femininity to flourish and display it in a space that not only is accepting, but where you're celebrated, right? And some of the first drag pageants, I think, were really important to people for that reason too. If you were constantly facing discrimination, it might have been difficult to find a space where you could express yourself artistically in mainstream society, but drag gave people that. Drag also gave people the space to navigate and participate in traditional culture, especially when you look at people like Lady Laura. She did a lot of music inspired by her heritage, a lot of like traditional ranchera and norteño music. And so drag often gave people the space to take part in their traditional culture, even if their traditional culture sometimes rejected them and didn't provide or give them a space. It also gave people a chance to see visibility, authenticity, and leadership. And then there was also, you know, a lot of times if you were growing up and you were queer in the 1970s, you didn't see anybody who looked like you on TV or hear anybody who was like you on the radio. And especially if you were a queer Latinx person, I think it was really difficult at times to find any kind of representation. And then you walk into a bar and go see a drag show and all you see is pop culture that represents you, right? Or interpretations of pop culture that represent you. I think drag was also really important because it allowed for the creation of families and support systems to replace or supplement unaccepting families of origins. So in the Valley, like in a lot of other places, there were drag families, drag mothers, drag fathers, drag children, and they would often not only mentor each other and support each other when it came to the art of drag, but also provide accepting family structures when families of origins might not have been providing that. A lot of young trans people, especially that we interviewed, some of that first generation of very visible trans youth in the Valley in the 80s and 90s, they were kicked out or pushed out by their families. And so their family support system really came from the other trans people they met. And a lot of times that came through the creation of drag houses. So you had like the House of Paris, the House of Duval, the House of York. And these were really, really important drag families that provided that kind of support. We also wanted to look at what activism looked like and what kind of impact people could have. And I think I made the mistake of thinking when I first started working on this project that the Valley didn't have a lot of like, you know, carrying signs and rallying and stuff like that. And so we didn't have a history of activism. And then I found out that we did have that. But I also, you know, this has been an interesting project to explore what the impact that LGBTQ plus people can have on the community around them just by being themselves. So I think in a time like the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, one of the most radical acts of activism you could partake in was just being visibly yourself, just being visibly and authentically yourself. I think sometimes we tend to look at the progress that the LGBTQ plus community has made over the past few years, and we think, oh, well, society evolved and society got better and society became more accepting. But society didn't do that on its own. It had to be forced by queer and trans people to become more accepting and to create more affirming spaces. And I think the way that a lot of people do that was just by refusing to not be themselves, by authentically committing to being themselves in public in ways that kind of had a domino effect and impacted other people around them, whether that was people who became more accepting or other LGBT people who were inspired by them. And we look at that a lot in our documentary. We explore sort of the impact that people had by just being themselves. By refusing to back down in the face of repression and by providing education to community members and also by creating affirmative and supportive spaces. And this picture with the signs are two women from the Valley who were two of the main organizers of the community in the 1980s and 1990s. And they took part in a protest for hate crimes legislation in 1995. And that's what these pictures are of. And then the one with the shorter blonde hair was part of a troupe of performers that started performing at a straight nightclub on South Padre Island in the late 1970s. And she's held onto this flyer from that first performance all this time, and that's what that flyer is. It was inspired by the movie Cabaret. So we're gonna show some of our favorite pictures from this history and talk a little bit about them. And Ronnie, if there's anything you wanna say about any of these, feel free. This is Joe's Place. Is a place it was a bar in the 1940s that existed in Reynosa, Mexico. And Joe's Place was notable for being really extravagant. It attracted a lot of traffic and attention from this side of the border. Reynosa is a border town just across the border from McAllen. And it was really interesting because one of the things that we found out through interviewing a person who did a lot of research on the Rio Grande Valley in the 1940s and 1950s was that Joe's Place had drag shows. There was a family-friendly show at 9, topless dancers at 12, and if you stuck around to, I think it was 2 a.m., you would see a really awesome drag show. And this was in the 1940s and 1950s. And unfortunately, we don't know too much about the lives of the drag queens that took part in these shows they might have been trans women, they might have been gay men doing drag, they might have been people who were just doing it for entertainment purposes. Most likely it was a mix of all three, but we found this postcard for Joe's Place on eBay, actually. And so it was really cool to have heard this story and now to be able to like visualize it. This is a picture of a person that we interviewed named Jackie Fabiani, who, like Lady Laura, also grew up as a migrant farm worker in the Rio Grande Valley and eventually became one of the leading drag queens and activists in the Valley in the 1990s. But this is a picture taken in middle school with two of her friends that she met in junior high or in elementary school, and they found each other. They were the only three kind of out kids. They couldn't really hide it. You know, Jackie always jokes when we interviewed her, she said, when did I come out? Well, when I was born, because I could never hide it. And she found two other people like herself in school in the Valley in the early 1970s. And so they formed this kind of clique that protected each other against the bullying that they were experiencing. And Jackie remains friends with the one in the center to this day. They remain close friends. The one on the right passed away in the 1980s from AIDS-related complications. But something you started to see in the Valley in the 1960s and 1970s that was really powerful and that kind of laid the groundwork for some of the community that came later was these really young kids being really willing to be themselves. And even though they were bullied and harassed, sometimes to the point where they dropped out, they found other people like themselves and created these tiny little pockets in all the different schools and supported each other and protected each other and affirmed each other. And that is a really, really important part of how how LGBT communities are built. Similarly, this is a picture from Angela Garza, who we showed earlier. Her uncle was an out gay man who also did drag in the early 1970s. He passed away in 1975 at a young age from an undiagnosed illness, but he has these amazing pictures of himself and his friends hanging out, just being really, really queer, being really, really themselves. And there's great ones, and they're a little blurry, but they're so beautiful. And I think one of the things I love about them is that they really show, you know, like it's such a privilege to see the snapshot of like queer people being themselves and experiencing community at this time. And one of the things she said that her mother told her when she gave her these pictures was that her uncle, most of these pictures were taken outdoors, you know, in the monte. Because queer people didn't have any other place to go at the time. This was in the early 70s before the first gay bar in the Valley opened. And so what they would do was make their own spaces, find parks, find nature centers and montes, and just kind of hang out and create space there. This is a flyer for the very first gay bar in the Valley. It was called Duffy's Tavern. It actually opened in the late 1940s as a street bar, but by the early 1970s, it starts to attract a really big gay presence. And from what we've been able to piece together, the owner really encouraged that. She had a lot of gay friends. She loved her gay friends. And so she made it a gay bar. And by 1975, it was being advertised in This Week in Texas, which is a statewide publication that existed through the 70s, 80s, and 90s and into the early 2000s. And this is the ad for Duffy's. So we were really lucky to be able to find this one. And Duffy's was the only gay bar in the Valley for most of the early to mid 1970s. And then in 1976, 1977, you started to see other ones pop up. But Duffy's was where you saw the first drag show in the Valley. And it took place on July 4th, 1975. And these are pictures of two of the drag queens. We don't have any pictures of that first show. These were all people who had never done drag before. They were mostly teens. Some of them were originally from Reynosa, and they moved to McAllen to be able to be themselves as queer and trans people. But these are pictures of Shady Lady and Isaac Sanchez, who performed as Sashay Sanchez. And they were two of the participants in this first show. And they stayed friends until Shady passed away a few years ago, in 2016, I believe. If you're from San Antonio and you ever got to see Shady Lady was a fixture of the San Antonio drag community. She left the Valley and moved to San Antonio in the late 1980s. And she would, you know, mix elegance and camp in a way that a lot of people couldn't do. So she would come out in an elegant ball gown, but then roll around on the floor and do comedy bits. And she became a favorite for that reason, and especially among San Antonio's Latinx queer community. So there's a lot of connections between the Valley and other parts of Texas through this network that starts to form in the 1970s when a lot of drag queens become active in the Valley. These are more pictures of Shady Lady taken circa the 80s and early 1990s. This is a picture of my uncle, Leonardo. And Leonardo he's the one sitting cross-legged with the mustache. He was such an attractive person, but I actually didn't know what he looked like as an adult until I started doing this project. And then one of his friends who I'd interviewed gave me some of these photos. And this is him throwing a party in the early 1970s with some of his queer friends. And Leonardo, again, I grew up knowing very little about him, and then I found out that he played a huge role in shaping and growing the local drag community, which was amazing to find out. And he opened Bumpers, which was, as far as we know, the second gay bar in the Valley. It was located pretty near Duffy's in the town of McAllen, but it was kind of hidden. It was hidden down an alley, and that might have been done strategically to avoid harassment or, to kind of give some privacy to the people going in and out. But one of the downsides was that once people found out it was a gay bar, they'd be waiting outside to harass people, which also is something that you saw at Duffy's, unfortunately. But people kept showing up. People kept going to these bars. And so this is a drag queen named Vera Cruz, who was also in that very first drag show, performing at Bumpers. And Bumpers was the first gay bar owned by a gay person in the Valley. This is Isaac Sanchez, who we saw in earlier photos. And he was also in that first drag show, but he also played a part in another really significant moment in Valley LGBT history. There was a homophobic politician named Anita Bryant who argued that LGBT people were a threat to the structure of the American family, and that non-discrimination ordinances and other laws that allowed for LGBT equality needed to be permanently banned. Sounds familiar, right? We're still fighting that same battle right now, unfortunately. But she did this kind of hate tour. She was originally a singer, and she did this kind of hate tour of the South. And in a lot of cities, the protests that formed by the gay community in reaction to her were kind of the groundwork for laying the foundations for LGBT activism in the South. The impact that it had in the Valley was that Isaac was interviewed on TV to talk about his feelings about Anita Bryant coming to McAllen. And the news station was looking, this was in 1977, and the news station was looking for somebody who was willing to talk about themselves as an out queer person on local TV. And not surprisingly, they weren't really able to find anybody. But a lot of people had told them about Isaac because he'd been performing in drag and was well known, has like this loud booming voice and a big personality. And so they interviewed him, and that made him the first queer person that we know of, first gay person that we know of to be out about their sexuality on local media in the Rio Grande Valley. This is another picture from Bumpers. It's one of my favorite. It's of a performer. So Bumpers is where you started to see the growth of a huge drag community in the Rio Grande Valley, and you just started to see more local queens. And a lot of that was Leonardo's insistence. Leonardo helped a lot of queens kind of find their start. This is Sweet Savage. She also eventually moved to San Antonio. She recently passed away last year, but she became a nationally well-known drag queen. But she came from the barrio in Edinburgh, and she got her start performing at Bumpers. And this is a picture of her in the late 1970s. And she eventually won several national pageants and was on national talk shows, but she made San Antonio her home. This is a picture of Lady Laura, who we saw some clips of. And the picture on the left is her first night in drag. Bumpers had a little drag pageant where you could compete in it every month and then win a prize at the end of the year and become a regular at the bar. And so she competed and won on her first night. This is a picture of another pageant at Bumpers, which I love this picture. And then these are some other pictures. This is Lori and Alicia. This was taken in 1981. And I just love anything I can find, anything that we can find of queer people just being in love and open and public is just so beautiful. And so these are really precious gifts left to us, I think, or that we've had the privilege of being able to share and include in our documentary. And so this is them camping shortly after they got together. They actually met at Bumpers in 1981. And then on the right is a picture of Jessica Welch, who is a drag queen who continues to perform until to this day. And this is at PBD's, which is the oldest gay bar in South Texas. It's been open since 1984 continuously. And I always say that we have probably because of the isolation that we experience here in the Valley and the Vasquacha style, we have a very creative drag community. And I think this picture really captures this with this like half man, half woman look. This is a picture from 10th Avenue, which opened in 1987. The year I was born, and it eventually became sort of the central hub of the Rio Grande Valley's LGBT community, and became really, really important to generations of queer people who grew up in the valley. And it was open from 87 to 2002, when it was open until 2002 when the city kind of forced it down. And that's a story, forced it to close down. That's a story we tell. This is a performance from Las Ventanas. the straight bar on the island, where that drag king organized a troupe of performers, and they did this they did a lot of extravagant numbers that you didn't see at some of the smaller bars, and they did a Pac-Man number in 1981, so you can see some of that creativity. This is a picture, kind of a sadder one. Unfortunately, the AIDS crisis in the Rio Grande Valley really had a major impact in shaping the community, and it had a disastrous toll in terms of the lives who were lost, especially in a place like the Valley, where there wasn't a lot of access because of the kind of more conservative culture. There wasn't always access to safer sex information and to queer affirming spaces, and so you saw a devastating impact of the HIV/AIDS epidemic when it hit the Valley in the mid-1980s. But it also gave rise to some really amazing activism. It really galvanized the community to take their activism outside of the bars and to really start to support each other and advocate for each other in different ways. But this is a picture taken by a photographer from New York named Will Fowler, who in 1994 did a series called Caras de la Sida, chronicling the AIDS crisis along the Rio Grande Valley. This is someone we interviewed in the documentary named Micah Lee Arellano, and he actually, he was one of the first workers at a hospice shelter that was opened by a local nun in 1988 to take care of people who were dying of AIDS because there was nowhere else for them to go, really. And he would go out to the clubs and do outreach, fill up this Mexican sombrero with condoms and just throw them out to people. So to me, it's a very Valley photo, very queer Latinx. And then these are outreach workers from the Valley AIDS Council, which started in 1988 to address the HIV/AIDS crisis. They would go and do outreach at local bars. And this is them actually at a bar in Brownsville called the Club 440. Valley Voice, again, was sort of the Rio Grande Valley's first LGBTQ plus advocacy organization, and it formed in the late 80s. And it was one of the first LGBTQ plus advocacy organizations to form in the Rio Grande Valley. These are some pictures from Valley Voice. It started in the late 80s, and it really gave people a space to socialize outside of the clubs, and it attracted a lot of queer and trans youth who were very involved in it. So these are some of those pictures from Valley Voice. And this is a fundraiser they did. They did a lot of fundraisers to support people who were affected by HIV/AIDS in the community, and then they also helped put together the first AIDS quilt in the Valley to commemorate people whose lives were lost due to the pandemic. So these are some of the other pictures. This is some of the first trans community to come out of 10th Avenue. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, you start to see the rise of a visible trans community in the Valley, centered around 10th Avenue. A lot of young people, a lot of people who've been forced out of their homes. And unfortunately, there was a series of violent crimes that targeted this community throughout the 1990s, and that's one of the stories we tell. We also tell the stories of queer families and what it was like to start a queer family in the Rio Grande Valley in a time like the 1980s and 1990s, and we interview some of those people. What it was like to start the first queer church in the Rio Grande Valley, the first queer student alliance organization in the Rio Grande Valley in 1992, and some amazing stories of drag queens and how they really stepped up to support and represent the community during the AIDS crisis. So these are all just some pictures of Valley drag queens in the 1980s and 1990s. And I'll wrap up this portion of the presentation. Some of the most powerful stuff came from young people. So this is a picture of the first same-sex prom date that we know of in the Valley, and we tell that story in our documentary. And then the first GSA in the Rio Grande Valley and the struggles they faced to kind of establish themselves. And one of the founders ended up being interviewed in The Advocate magazine in 2002 as one of the coolest straight people of 2002. And that's a story that we tell. It's one of my favorite parts of the documentary. It's how these kids stood up to this administration that didn't want them to exist.
Okay, and then Gabriel, if you want to stop sharing your screen, I'll start sharing over here on this side, so that way we can show just a few clips here at the end. So just to come back to the last slide here real quick. So we were recently featured in the Monitor here in McAllen, the McAllen Monitor newspaper, on the front page for a preview series that we released in June called Drag Herstories. On the bottom right, you can see four of the profiles that we did, but I think we did 7 or 8 profiles during June. So We're going to show maybe just a few clips here. We're going to move into the Q&A here in just a minute, but we wanted to show you just a few clips from here. You can see the full clips on our social media. We have them on IGTV, on Facebook, on YouTube, so you can check them out whenever you have time. They're short. They're only about like 5 minutes each, but we wanted to highlight a couple of them just to let you know that they're there. So Gabriel,
I think we can go and start with maybe Frank.
Okay, we'll do Frank, the beginning of Frank, or the second half? Okay, so we're going to show some of the beginning of this herstory, and then we're going to jump to the end to kind of catch part of the last part of this one as well. So give me just a second. I'll go ahead and share that one. Okay, and so this is going to be a YouTube share. Okay, you guys got it? Okay. So hopefully this is going to share a little bit better.
We used to be afraid to walk outside by ourselves, because we were being targeted, just for being gay. Had we not fought back a chingazos, not giving into that fear, not giving into demands of us not existing because we were not wanted. That's why I say, if I had any advice to give to them was listen to those who already walked your path. The first gay bar I went to, I walked into, was the Other Face on 29th. And that's where Jackie was born. Jackie Fabiani. That's the first time I saw a drag show. And I thought, wow, I could do that. I could put on my own flower dress. Keisha was amazing. I mean, she was a goddess. She was beautiful, talented. I couldn't believe she actually singled me out. She called me to the backstage. She wanted to talk to me. And she told me, you need help, and I'm going to help you. And you're coming with me. And from then on, she guided me. She taught me everything I know about drag.
Gabriel, what do you think? I think should we continue playing it through, or
let's show people like the very end, like the last minute, maybe the part.
In 98, boy, did I see my death. Like it come right in front of my face. I got to a point where I weighed 72 pounds. I had no immune system. The doctor from Valley Aids Council told me that I had 2 years to live. The most. I went to Idaho to die. But that was in 98. And I've been undetectable for almost 10 years already. 10 to 15 years. Yeah. This bitch ain't going nowhere.
Okay, so that was the first clip, and then Gabriel, do you have a suggestion, or did you want to make any comments about that one before we move on to the next one? We got about 10 minutes in general.
Yeah, I think just it's great because if you go check out that clip, one of the reasons Jackie was so significant, she's actually the last interview we did, but we felt it was really important to interview her. She was living in Idaho at the time, and we helped her come down here. But she was the first drag queen to be out about her status, not just in the Valley, but possibly one of the first in Texas. A lot of times people would die, and that's when the community would find out that they have been HIV positive. But she made the decision when she was diagnosed in 92 to be out about it. And there's some stuff in that clip about why she was so determined to win a title so she could have a bigger platform to talk about HIV/AIDS stigma and the need for education around HIV/AIDS. So I recommend everybody go check that one out.
What do you want to play next?
Let's play some of Maya's.
Maya's? Okay. What part? The beginning, the middle, the end?
Let's do the beginning and then the end, kind of similar to this one.
Okay. All right. I'll go ahead and do Maya's.
My name is Maya Murray. We're here at my home here in Edinburgh, Texas. My father is African American. My mother is Hispanic. They met here in the Valley. I was born here in the Valley, but I was raised in Seattle, but came back down when I was about, 15, 14. It was just very closed-minded. It wasn't very open-minded here when I first moved here. Not even me being Black was it all right. The first time I walked into the cafeteria, everybody stared at me and I felt very uncomfortable. I stared at everybody stared at me. I couldn't even sit. I walked straight past everybody and went straight out of the cafeteria. Everybody stared at me. I stared at them. It was just very uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. I was an African American and I was in an all Hispanic school. So it was a little awkward. And then me being a little feminine was also, not part of their, I don't know. They just didn't like it, I guess. I've learned,
So these clips are short. So that's the beginning, and then this will be the end.
with a pageant Miss 10th Avenue, and I ended up winning. And I started performing there as a crowned queen. And ever since then, I started going inside.
What was Valerie like to you?
She was somebody that I could really look up to. She was somebody that was strong, confident in herself. I used to sit there and look at her all day long when she was in the mirror doing her makeup in the back of the dressing rooms, and she'd always look out for us girls, us younger girls, she'd always make sure that we were okay, so I love her for that. So I never liked makeup or anything like that. So when I first started, I shaved off all my hair. I wasn't short hair blonde, I did a lot of Tony and a lot of Eve, the rapper Eve. I did a lot of Eve. I don't know if you ever knew a queen named Keisha Ross. She was another Black queen. We did The Boy Is Mine. And we actually fought each other on stage, threw each other's wigs off and everything. So it was really crazy, but big connection between us, like all the time, and I was very sad that when she passed, but yeah, she was like sort of my African American sister here.
Okay, so that was that clip. We'll go ahead and maybe show one more if we have time. Gabriel, are you still there?
Tina's or maybe a little bit of Tina's and a little bit of Derek's.
Okay, a little bit of Tina's, a little bit of Derek's. Okay, give me just a second. I'll go ahead and pull up Tina's. about that. Let me try and share that one more time. I apologize. I think I didn't share the audio. I apologize for that. StreamYard. Oh, StreamYard. Okay. There we go. Sorry, guys. Had to reload it. Oh, I didn't share it with the audio again. Okay. Sorry. Apologize. All the buttons.
Tina Marie Lopez, born here and raised in Edinburgh, Texas. Still living here. Early on, first grade, second grade, I started liking my teachers, crushes on my teachers. And fifth grade, I finally started kissing girls, and I liked it. And sixth grade, I got with my girlfriend. We were together 5 years. I was 17 at the time. June 25th, I want to say it was 1980. And I started dating this girl from here, from Edinburgh. And when the family found out, they kidnapped me, they beat me, they tied me up, cut me up. But it was a big thing. It was on the, it was on the news. It was in the papers. It came out that it was over a lesbian affair, and that was a big thing back then. It was like, oh, Mr. Lopez's and Miss Lopez's daughter. They couldn't believe it because my mother had her own beauty shop, and he was a teacher at the school. So it was like a big dent to them. Like, whoa. First gay bar I went to was Bumpers, and then PBD's. I always wanted to perform, and I wanted to male impersonate. So I just one day asked if I could, and was told, go ahead, try it. And that was the first of Michael and Anthony. I loved watching Toya perform. I wanted to be just like Toya. Get the crowd riled up like Toya did. Toya always had them on their feet, She always got good tips. She loved everybody, and everybody loved Toya. Toya was Mark Anthony, and was an older male impersonator back in the day. And when I started coming out, he kind of helped me pick the name. And my son, Toya, was very, very persistent to get me to do shows.
I think that's all the time that we have in terms of playing the clip. So we just want to show the beginning of that clip there from Tina. Did you want to say anything about that clip in particular, Gabriel?
No. Okay.
So let me throw it back to Professor Ramos. I don't know if there are any questions that you had for us, or I'll just hand it over to you at this point.
No, thank you all so much. I was trying not to cry. I was trying to take this all in because I've said to two filmmakers, Gabriel and Ronnie, that I'm from Brownsville. I'm from the Valley. My whole family on both sides is from the Valley. And I was racking my brain. I'm like, do I know Bumpers? Do I know this place? I'm like, wow, I honestly don't think I knew all this. And this is going to be so amazing when it's done. You all are doing so much to bring light to so many represented, undertold stories. So I can't wait. And I feel like we're so privileged to get this sneak peek. So thank you both from the bottom of our hearts. It's amazing. Having said that, I would like to see if there's anyone in the comments. I see some familiar names. If anybody has a question or a comment or anything that you would like to say, please post it right now. I'll give you all like a minute or two, but maybe what I can do is kind of get the ball rolling, and just a question for both of you all. Making films like this is not only necessary, but it's very powerful. So I wonder, when you all were making this and you were hearing these stories, how did it leave you all after you finished filming a session and hearing the stories? Were your reactions also, oh, I never knew this? Or I know, Gabriel, you confirmed that you started learning about your uncle and, you know, started learning his history, but what was it like for you all emotionally making this, and also being from the Valley?
Gabriel, you want to answer? You want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, it was tough. In some ways, I would get very emotional. I think after a lot of these, you know, both of us were really emotional, especially learning about some of the tragic effects of transphobia and violence and the AIDS epidemic. But I also do not look at the Valley the same way. When I'm driving around, and of course I'm not doing much driving right now because of COVID, but when I was driving around, you know, now I see the street corner where the trans sex workers in Brownsville used to hang out in the 80s, and this place that used to be a bar off in the middle of nowhere in Ghana in the mid-1970s. So it's changed my perception of the Valley and made us realize that we did leave an impact everywhere, you know?
And then I would answer that by saying that yes, I think that there were definitely some interviews that were very heavy, and then, you know, we both felt it kind of in the moment, and it was kind of like a special moment of sorts. And then there were other interviews where I remember more or less being so distracted with filming the interview and making sure that the cameras were rolling, the sound was rolling, all that kind of stuff, that I only, you know, got emotional in retrospect. Like once we had a chance to look at the footage or even cut the footage, did I even, you know, like, oh, that's what they were talking about, kind of stuff. So, but there were definitely some pretty heavy interviews that we did, and some intense topics and stuff like that. And those were interesting. Those were, I mean, Frank's was very much like that at times, but there were a bunch of really great interviews.
I think the first time we shot, we both cried, which was at the first Pride, when we heard about a little boy who had died of AIDS, and he was a young boy born with HIV, but he was rejected by the whole community, and only the LGBT community really stepped up to support him and fundraise to support the family, and we both were kind of in tears after that. And then one last thing I want to say: if you look at these interviews, like especially if you look at the drag histories, they look amazing. The way that, and that's all Ronnie. I mean, there was so much time and care taken into like how they look, that I, having never made a movie, didn't really have an appreciation for until after these were made. And that's one of the feedbacks we got about the drag history videos, was just like how good they looked. And yeah. Well,
and so yeah, I mean, that's me and Charlie. I shot most of these interviews for Pansy, but me and Charlie Vela, my partner on As I Walk Through the Valley, has been working with us to get this thing finished, you know, with all the technical details, the color, and the, you know, just making sure that everything pops and all that kind of good stuff. So we're still cranking through it, and I'm lucky to be working with as strong a team as we have.
So a question for you both. You have seemingly collected an archive of flyers, pictures, and so much more. Do you have plans to add the material to an archival collection?
I can do a real quick answer to that, and then Ronnie, if you want to add anything. But we have an Instagram account. That's been one of my favorite things about this project. We run an Instagram account where we share pictures from our archives, stories from our archives, and post on there pretty regularly, and try to make it as diverse as possible, a representation of this community. So if you go on there, that's sort of an archive in a lot of ways, because we're sharing these pictures and stories. But one of my dreams or goals, I have an annual exhibit that I put together and curated on this history that we show every year at Pride at the local Pride Month celebration. And after this documentary is done, I really want to do like a digital archive of some of this and make it more easily accessible to people. So that's another long-term project that I've had in working on this.
Yeah, and then I think that it's definitely it definitely should survive in some sort of archive. So hopefully that comes to fruition. And we have a bunch of stuff from As I Walk Through the Valley too. I mean, I think that there's definitely a space for a good update to the RGV archive, wherever that is. I think there's a lot of material that we've amassed recently that should go somewhere, because it's part of our history. I mean, if you think about the local news and stuff like that, we wanted to get footage and things like that from the local news for As I Walk Through the Valley, and they throw that stuff away. If it's too old, they get rid of it. So there's pieces in here that really need to be preserved in some way.
Yeah, and I think really archives, when documenting LGBTQ plus history, it's really important for it to come from within the community. So that's one of the reasons that once this project is done and the documentary is done, I really would love to do a way to archive all of this and organize it and make it available.
So the next question comes from Jackie Velez, who works at SAC. Hi, Jackie. So her question, 2 questions. Was there anyone who was maybe hesitant on filming the interviews? If so, how did you approach the situation?
Gabriel, you want to start with that one?
Sure. Almost everybody was hesitant from the older crowd. And there were people, some of the people even in these pictures, who did not want to be interviewed because they weren't out to their families, or, if you grew up living in fear of your identity being discovered, and even if you were very out, on a personal level, I think there's still some fear in putting yourself and your identity out there, and also talking about some of these difficult experiences. So that was actually one of the biggest challenges I faced, was just like talking to people in a way that made them feel comfortable with wanting to be on camera and wanting to be part of this project. But yeah, there was, I would say, about 50 to 60% of the people were a little hesitant. And then other people were like, oh yeah, I'll do my makeup and I'll see you on Saturday. So.
Well, and I'll just add one little bit to that. I mean, part of that hesitancy, does it affects the location. It's like, where can we film this? And it's like, well, come to my place and stuff. And so, for those who were very eager and were ready to go in terms of doing the interview, I think that allowed us to do things in a more open and public way and find some really cool locations. But these other ones where people were hesitant, there's an intimate feeling to those interviews as well. So it has its benefits and its drawbacks.
So I also wanted to ask, let me move on to the next question. So this is from Adrian Melgar. What has been the most interesting LGBT plus historical artifacts you all have had the chance to see or exhibit?
Yeah, so in the process of doing this, we've collected a ton of photos, and then I also have some stuff from the exhibit that I've put together. And some of my favorite things are some of the older drag outfits. I think the pictures are invaluable. There's some pictures that are just like priceless. I mean, we're just so lucky to have found them that show people being, themselves despite all the risks, and there's so much power in that. The In Touch magazines are one of my favorite things too. I think it's just so powerful to see something that was made by the community, for the community, with very little access to resources, that was such a mix of like personal, but also news and informative stuff, and to hear stuff and read stuff written by the community at that time is priceless. So that's probably my favorite, is those issues of In Touch that we have.
And I would say, those Valley Voice T-shirts are also priceless. And then the AIDS quilt. I had never heard of the AIDS quilt until we were filming out at Pride, and so it was really cool to see that. And then we were able to film part of an interview in front of it, and so to kind of like memorialize it a little bit. So that was a very interesting thing to see. To encounter.
So a comment from Richard Arredondo. I learned a lot about the South Texas LGBTQ plus community. Well done, best wishes. And I also wanted to ask, I'm presuming that you've been able to screen some of the video clips in the Valley. If you have, what has been the reaction? If you haven't, any plans to?
We have screened in the Valley just a little bit. So some preview clips. So back in 2019, we showed 3 preview clips at Pride. And that involved Valley Voice. It involved a little bit of our HIV and AIDS section, and a little bit about Duffy's and the first drag show. So that's what we've been able to preview in person, in an in-person screening so far. And then the drag histories, we would have showed those at Pride, but of course, it's much harder to do screenings now these days.
So next question. I've found friends, queer and straight, from the RGV are surprised to find out about the history you are uncovering. Is that a common reaction? Yeah, that's what I wanted to know. What is the reaction?
Yeah, that's been one of the most interesting things when I've done presentations on this, or when we've shown clips, or even in the comments in our Instagram or the reactions to our Instagram. It's just people being amazed at this wealth of history, because it's not just that we existed. We're a very rich and diverse, and have been a very rich and diverse community that's done a lot of amazing things. And I think people are always surprised. I was really surprised when we started doing this and when I found out a lot about this. So I can understand that. Ronnie, do you want to?
Well, I mean, I think, I'm surprised. So yeah, I think people aren't even surprised enough yet. I think they're still going to learn more in the documentary. They just have seen what's in the presentation, in the Instagram and stuff. But there is a lot of detail, and so much so that we can't cover it all. We're fighting. We're really struggling for the ability to fit in all these stories into a feature. So that is itself has been a challenge. You're on mute. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I kept remembering and then I forget at the very last moment. So I was saying it's 7:29. We got 1 minute. So I just wanted to remind everyone our next event is tomorrow night. It's a student-led event. Gregory Garrett Estrada, one of our students at SAC, is leading it. So I hope that if you are available, some of you there in the comments who are still with us, if you want to attend, it should be a great event. It's going to have student leaders from all over the nation. But lastly, I just wanted to thank everyone. Most of all, Gabriel and Ronnie, thank you for sharing these clips with us. I can't wait to go tell my family and friends in the Valley about this. I want them to be on the lookout for it. I know Dr. Bueno, who's behind the scenes, I want to mention her. So Dr. Miriam Bueno has been our behind the scenes guru, changing everyone, making all the transitions. Thank you. I know it's not an easy task. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much, Dr. Bueno. And also to our wonderful interpreters, Beatrice and Crystal, thank you all for taking your time and supporting us tonight. And yeah, can't wait till the film comes out. I'll let you all have the last word. So Gabriel and then Ronnie.
Thank you all so much for for being here today. And this is something I can talk forever about. So thank you for letting me indulge in that a little bit, and hopefully it was interesting. There's so much more to come. Stay tuned for the documentary, and follow us on Instagram at Pansy Pachanga, and on Facebook at Pansy Pachanga, and on YouTube as well. All Pansy Pachanga to stay updated and to learn more about this history.
And yeah, I just want to thank everybody over at San Antonio College. Thank you, Dr. Ramos. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you to our interpreters and everybody who helped set this up. We had a great time. Thank you so much for having us. And just like Gabriel said, follow us on social media. As I Walk Through the Valley, Pansy Pachanga, 11,000 years of history in the Rio Grande Valley. We're telling stories that we think need to be told, and we're from the region, and I think we have a unique take on how to tell this history.
So that is a wrap. Thank you to our wonderful audience. We hope to see you at our next event. Good night, be well and be safe. Hasta luego.